Was Hermann Göring gay? This question has lingered in historical discussions for decades, whispered in biographical accounts, debated among historians, and sensationalized in popular media. Hermann Göring, the flamboyant Reichsmarschall of Nazi Germany, Hitler's designated successor and commander of the Luftwaffe, remains one of the most complex and contradictory figures of the Third Reich. His life was marked by excess, vanity, corruption and brutality, but also by 2 documented marriages and a lifestyle that defied simple categorization. The question of his sexuality has been raised repeatedly, fueled by rumors that circulated during his lifetime, propaganda from both Allied and rival Nazi sources, and his own theatrical personality that seemed at odds with the hypermasculine ideals the Nazi regime promoted. To understand whether there is any historical basis for these claims, we must examine not just rumors and accusations, but documented evidence, the political context in which such accusations arose, and the very nature of how sexuality was weaponized in the propaganda wars of the 20th century. In this video, we will explore Hermann Göring's documented relationships, his marriages, his lifestyle and personality, the origins of rumors about his sexuality, the role of propaganda in shaping these narratives, what his contemporaries said about him, and ultimately what historians have concluded based on available evidence. This is not a simple question with a simple answer, but rather a window into how personal accusations become political weapons, how we distinguish between documented fact and wartime rumor, and how one of history's most notorious figures lived his private life amidst the public spectacle he created. So without further ado, let's begin by examining the man himself and the life he actually led. Hermann Wilhelm Göring was born on January 12, 1893 in Rosenheim, Bavaria, into a family with strong connections to German colonial administration. His father, Heinrich Ernst Göring, had served as the first Governor-General of German Southwest Africa, and his mother, Franziska Tiefenbrunn, came from a Bavarian peasant family. From his earliest years, Göring was surrounded by an atmosphere of imperial grandeur and military tradition. His childhood, however, was marked by an unusual arrangement that would later fuel psychological speculation about his development. His mother's lover, Hermann Eppenstein, a wealthy Jewish physician and businessman, became the family's patron and benefactor. The Göring family lived in Eppenstein's castles, first at Weldenstein and later at Mautendorf, with young Hermann spending much of his childhood in these grand settings while his father served abroad. This complicated domestic arrangement, where the family depended on the financial support of his mother's paramour, created a complex psychological foundation that some biographers have explored at length. Young Hermann was sent to boarding schools, where he developed a reputation as both a bright student and a troublemaker with a violent temper. He attended the Karlsruhe Military Academy and later the Main Cadet Academy at Lichterfelde, where he excelled in military training and showed the first signs of the ambition that would define his career. His early life showed no documented evidence of same-sex relationships or inclinations, though his emotional volatility and need for attention were already apparent. Göring's entry into manhood came through military service in World War I, where he distinguished himself as one of Germany's most celebrated fighter aces. He joined the Prince Wilhelm Regiment as an infantry officer in 1914, but after suffering from rheumatism in the trenches, he transferred to the Imperial German Air Service in 1915. This decision would define his life and career. As a fighter pilot, Göring proved himself brave and skilled, eventually shooting down 22 enemy aircraft and earning the coveted Pour le Mérite, Germany's highest military honor. In 1918, he assumed command of the legendary Jagdgeschwader 1, the fighter wing previously led by the famous Red Baron, Manfred von Richthofen. This position placed him at the pinnacle of German military aviation and established his reputation as a war hero. During these years, Göring developed close friendships with fellow pilots, living in the intense camaraderie that characterized fighter squadrons. Some later accounts would attempt to read homosexual undertones into these military friendships, but such interpretations ignore the historical context of male bonding in combat units and the documentary evidence of Göring's heterosexual relationships during this same period. In 1917, while recovering from wounds in a military hospital, Göring met and began a relationship with a nurse, though this romance did not lead to marriage. His letters and personal accounts from this period make no mention of romantic or sexual interest in men, focusing instead on his military achievements, his plans for the future, and his growing bitterness about Germany's deteriorating position in the war. The end of World War I devastated Göring both professionally and psychologically. The Treaty of Versailles disbanded the German Air Force, stripped Germany of its military aviation capability, and left former officers like Göring without a clear purpose. He refused to participate in what he considered the humiliating surrender of his unit's aircraft to the Allies, instead ordering his pilots to destroy their planes. In the chaotic years that followed, from 1919 to 1921, Göring worked as a commercial pilot in Denmark and Sweden, performing demonstration flights and working for Svensk Lufttrafik. It was during this period in Sweden that Göring met the woman who would become his first wife and great love, Karin von Kantzow, née Baroness Fock. This meeting in 1920 would decisively shape the next decade of his life and provide the first substantial evidence regarding his sexuality. Karin was a married Swedish aristocrat, 5 years older than Göring, with an 8-year-old son from her marriage to Captain Niels von Kantzow. Despite the social complications, Göring and Karin fell deeply in love. The intensity and passion of their relationship is well documented through hundreds of letters, diary entries, and testimonies from those who knew them. Karin divorced her husband in 1922 and married Göring in Munich on February 3, 1923. Their marriage, though tragically short, was by all accounts passionate and devoted. The relationship between Hermann and Karin Göring provides our first clear window into Göring's sexuality based on documented evidence rather than rumour. Karin's diaries and letters, preserved by her family and later published, reveal an intensely romantic and sexual relationship. She wrote of her husband's passionate nature, his jealousy when other men showed her attention, and their physical intimacy. These are not the writings of a woman married to a man indifferent to her as a woman, but rather the detailed accounts of someone deeply involved in a heterosexual marriage with all its emotional and physical dimensions. Göring, for his part, was utterly devoted to Karin. He named his vast country estate Karin Hall in her honour after her death, filled it with portraits and mementos of her, and spoke of her constantly in the years that followed. He wore her photograph close to his heart and created what amounted to a shrine to her memory. When Karin died of heart failure on October 17, 1931, Göring was devastated. Witnesses described him weeping uncontrollably at her funeral and falling into a deep depression that lasted months. This was not performance for public consumption, but private grief observed by family members and close associates. The depth and genuineness of Göring's love for Karin is one of the few purely human aspects of an otherwise monstrous figure, and it stands as significant evidence in any discussion of his sexuality. However, Göring's personality and lifestyle during the 1920s and 1930s also contained elements that fueled speculation and gossip. He was extraordinarily vain about his appearance, obsessed with uniforms and decorations, and loved theatrical displays. He designed numerous elaborate uniforms for himself, often changing clothes multiple times per day. He wore makeup, used perfume, and paid meticulous attention to his grooming in ways that exceeded even the considerable vanity of other Nazi leaders. His fingernails were manicured and sometimes painted with clear polish. He bathed in expensive oils and surrounded himself with luxuries. This preoccupation with appearance, combined with his increasingly flamboyant style, led some contemporaries to view him as effeminate, though this assessment confused aesthetic vanity with sexual orientation. Göring's vanity was rooted in narcissism and his need for admiration, not in sexual identity. He craved attention, praise, and recognition, and his elaborate self-presentation was a means of commanding the spotlight. Nevertheless, in a regime that promoted a harsh martial masculinity, Göring's theatrical style stood out and invited comment. By the time Adolf Hitler attempted his failed beer hall putsch in Munich on November 9, 1923, Göring had already joined the Nazi Party and become one of Hitler's earliest and most important supporters. Göring commanded the Sturmabteilung, the SA stormtroopers, during the putsch attempt. When police opened fire on the marchers, Göring was shot in the groin, a wound that would have lasting consequences for his health and personality. He and Karin fled to Austria and then Italy to avoid arrest. During his recovery, doctors prescribed morphine for the severe pain from his wound, beginning an addiction that would plague him for years. This morphine addiction, which he struggled with throughout the 1920s and periodically thereafter, altered his personality, contributing to mood swings, paranoia, and erratic behavior. It also caused significant weight gain once he reduced his usage, transforming him from the lean fighter pilot of his youth into the corpulent figure familiar from later photographs. Some accounts suggest the groin wound may have affected his sexual function, though Göring's later marriage and active social life suggest this was not a permanent disability. Nevertheless, the wound's location led to crude jokes and speculation, particularly among his political enemies within and outside the Nazi movement. During his exile in the mid-1920s, Göring and Karin lived in Italy and Austria before he felt safe enough to return to Germany following a general amnesty in 1927. These years were difficult financially, and Göring worked various jobs while positioning himself to rejoin Hitler's inner circle. Karin's health began to fail, suffering from epilepsy and a weak heart, conditions that grew worse as the stress of their uncertain circumstances took its toll. Despite these hardships, their relationship remained strong. When they returned to Germany, Göring threw himself back into Nazi Party politics, using his war hero status and aristocratic connections to build support among conservative and military circles. His charm, when he chose to employ it, was considerable. He could be witty, engaging, and persuasive, traits that served Hitler's movement well in attracting support from German elites who might otherwise have dismissed the Nazis as lower-class rabble. Göring's ability to move in high society, his connections to old military families, and his genuine war record gave the Nazi Party a respectability it otherwise lacked. As the Nazi Party grew in power through the early 1930s, Göring's position strengthened accordingly. He was elected to the Reichstag in 1928 and became its president in 1932, using this position to help Hitler's path to power. When Hitler became Chancellor on January 30, 1933, Göring was appointed Minister without Portfolio and Commissioner for Aviation, positions he used to begin building what would become the Luftwaffe, the new German Air Force. He also became Minister-President of Prussia and, crucially, took control of the Prussian police force. This gave him the power to begin implementing Nazi terror, establishing the first concentration camps and creating the Geheime Staatspolizei, the Gestapo, which he initially commanded before handing it over to Heinrich Himmler in 1934. The speed and brutality with which Göring exercised this power revealed the true nature beneath his jovial public persona. He authorized mass arrests, torture, and extrajudicial killings. He personally ordered the arrest and murder of political opponents, trade unionists, and others deemed enemies of the Nazi state. The concentration camp at Nuremberg, one of the first, operated under his authority, and he took pride in the fear his Gestapo instilled. Yet even as he built this apparatus of terror, Göring maintained an elaborate social life, hosting lavish parties at his various residences, collecting art on a massive scale, and cultivating an image as a Renaissance prince of sorts. His estate at Carinhall, named for his deceased first wife, became legendary for its opulence. Set in the Schorfheide forest north of Berlin, Carinhall was built in the style of a grand hunting lodge, but grew into a vast complex filled with looted art treasures, exotic animals, and every luxury imaginable. Göring used Carinhall to entertain foreign dignitaries, impress visitors, and indulge his appetites. The estate had a private zoo, and Göring kept lions as pets, dressing in various hunting and informal costumes to play the role of Grand Seigneur. Foreign visitors and diplomats who came to Carinhall often left with conflicting impressions. Some saw a cultivated man of sophisticated tastes, others saw a grotesque parody of nobility, and still others saw through the pageantry to the ruthless gangster beneath. On April 10, 1935, nearly 4 years after Karin's death, Hermann Göring married again. His second wife was Emmy Sonnemann, an actress he had been courting for some time. Emmy was born, Emma Johanna Henny Sonnemann, on March 24, 1893, the same year as Göring. She came from a middle-class family in Hamburg and had pursued a successful stage career, performing in various German theatres throughout the 1920s and early 1930s. She met Göring in 1932 at a performance in Weimar, and they began a relationship that led to marriage. The wedding was an enormous state occasion, attended by Hitler himself, who served as best man and became one of the major social events of the Nazi calendar. The marriage to Emmy provides further documentary evidence regarding Göring's sexuality. Like his relationship with Karin, his marriage to Emmy was by all accounts conventional in its heterosexual dynamic. Emmy herself later wrote a memoir, My Life with Göring, in which she described their relationship in detail. While her account is naturally defensive and seeks to portray her husband in the best possible light, it nevertheless describes an active marital relationship with normal physical intimacy. On June 2, 1938, Emmy gave birth to their daughter, Edda, named after Benito Mussolini's daughter. Göring was 45 years old, and the birth of his only child delighted him. He doted on Edda, showering her with attention and gifts, and spoke constantly of her to colleagues and visitors. The proud father became even more of a fixture at social events, bringing Edda when appropriate and boring guests with tales of her precocity. This biological fatherhood adds another layer of documented evidence regarding Göring's sexuality. While it does not definitively rule out bisexuality, it demonstrates active heterosexual function and desire. Emmy remained married to Göring until his death in 1946, surviving imprisonment and poverty after the war. In her later interviews and writings, she never suggested anything unusual about their intimate life, consistently portraying it as a normal marriage between a man and woman. So, where then did the rumours about Göring's sexuality originate? To understand this, we must examine the political context of Nazi Germany and the propaganda war that raged both within the regime and between Germany and its enemies. The Nazi Party was rife with internal rivalries, backstabbing and character assassination. Each major figure maintained networks of informants and spread damaging rumours about competitors. Heinrich Himmler and Reinhard Heydrich, who controlled the SS and the intelligence apparatus, collected files on everyone, including Göring, documenting real and fabricated scandals they could use as leverage. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, despised Göring and filled his diary with snide comments about Göring's weight, vanity, and incompetence. These internal Nazi rivalries produced a steady stream of gossip and innuendo about all the major figures, and accusations of sexual deviance were a favourite weapon, because they were difficult to disprove and carried the weight of Nazi ideology's obsession with degeneracy. The Nazi regime itself had a complicated and hypocritical relationship with homosexuality. Officially, the Nazis viewed homosexuality as a threat to the Aryan race, a form of degeneracy that weakened the nation and prevented the production of children for the Reich. Paragraph 175 of the German Criminal Code, which criminalized homosexual acts between men, was enthusiastically enforced and expanded under Nazi rule. Tens of thousands of men were arrested under this law, with estimates ranging from 50,000 to 100,000 prosecutions between 1933 and 1945. Many were sent to concentration camps where they wore pink triangles and suffered particularly brutal treatment. The Nazis claimed homosexuality could be cured through hard labor, medical experimentation, and punishment. This persecution was real, systematic, and deadly, making accusations of homosexuality within the Nazi hierarchy particularly dangerous and politically charged. However, the early Nazi movement itself had included prominent homosexuals, most notably Ernst Röhm, the chief of the SA stormtroopers and one of Hitler's oldest comrades. Röhm's homosexuality was an open secret in Munich political circles, yet Hitler tolerated it because Röhm was useful and loyal. Other SA leaders also had reputations as homosexuals, and the SA had a culture that was considerably more tolerant of same-sex relationships than the official party line would suggest. This changed dramatically during the Night of the Long Knives on June 30, 1934, when Hitler ordered the murder of Röhm and other SA leaders. While the purge was primarily about Hitler consolidating power and eliminating the SA as a rival to the army, the propaganda, justification emphasized the moral depravity of Röhm and his circle. Göring played a direct role in these killings, personally signing death warrants and coordinating arrests in Berlin, while Hitler dealt with the situation in Munich. The official story painted the SA leadership as a nest of homosexual degenerates, and this narrative was used to justify the bloodbath to both Nazi Party members and the German public. The Röhm purge established homosexuality as a useful accusation within Nazi politics. If you wanted to destroy someone's reputation or justify their removal, you accused them of sexual deviance. This weapon could be deployed against anyone, and the accusation alone was damaging, regardless of truth. The fact that Röhm actually had been homosexual lent credibility to subsequent accusations even when they were fabricated. In this environment, Göring's flamboyant personal style made him vulnerable to such whispers. His vanity, his elaborate uniforms, his love of makeup, and perfume, his theatrical gestures, all could be and were interpreted through a homophobic lens by his enemies. The fact that he violated Nazi masculine ideals in his self-presentation, even while being heterosexual in his actual sexual behavior, created cognitive dissonance that gossip could exploit. One specific source of rumors about Göring came from Ernst Udet, a former World War I flying ace who became a close friend and subordinate of Göring in the Luftwaffe. Udet, who eventually committed suicide in 1941 after the Luftwaffe's failures in the Battle of Britain, led to his scapegoating, allegedly told stories about Göring's behavior that fueled speculation. Some accounts suggest Udet made insinuations about Göring's sexuality, though the reliability of these third-hand reports is questionable. Udet was bitter about Göring's incompetent leadership of the Luftwaffe, his interference in aircraft development, and the blame being placed on Udet for problems Göring had created. In such circumstances, Udet had every reason to spread damaging gossip about his superior, and sexual innuendo would have been an obvious avenue for someone seeking to undermine Göring's reputation among other pilots and officers. Allied intelligence agencies also collected information and rumors about Nazi leaders, including their sexual lives, as part of psychological profiling and potential propaganda use. British and American intelligence services compiled extensive dossiers on Göring, examining everything from his art collecting to his drug addiction to his personality quirks. Some of these files included unverified rumors and gossip collected from defectors, refugees, and intelligence sources within Germany. The intelligence value of such information lay not in its truth but in its potential for psychological warfare and understanding the target's vulnerabilities. Reports about Göring's vanity, his concern with his appearance, and his theatrical nature filled these files, and some analysts drew conclusions about his psychology that reflected the homophobic assumptions of the era. A man who wore makeup and changed clothes multiple times per day must have something wrong with him sexually, the thinking went, conflating gender expression with sexual orientation in ways that revealed more about the analyst's prejudices than about Göring's actual behavior. During World War II, Allied propaganda occasionally deployed sexual innuendo about Nazi leaders as part of psychological operations. Political cartoons depicted Nazi leaders in compromising or emasculating positions. Jokes about Hitler's testicle, Goebbels' club foot, and Göring's weight and vanity circulated in Allied countries and were sometimes deliberately spread. The goal was to mock and diminish these figures, robbing them of their fearsome image. Göring's appearance made him an easy target for such ridicule. By the early 1940s, he had become enormously fat, with his weight reportedly exceeding 300 pounds. His uniforms had to be specially tailored to accommodate his girth, and he moved with difficulty. Allied cartoonists drew him as a grotesque, gluttonous figure dripping with medals, a buffoon rather than a dangerous enemy. This caricature served Allied morale by making Göring seem ridiculous, but it also fed into speculation about his private life because his appearance seemed to violate normal masculine standards. Within Germany, whispered criticism of Göring grew as his failures mounted. As head of the Luftwaffe, Göring bore responsibility for the German Air Force's performance, and that performance deteriorated badly as the war progressed. The failure to defeat the Royal Air Force during the Battle of Britain in 1940 was the first major blow to German air supremacy and to Göring's reputation. He had boasted that no Allied bomber would ever reach Berlin, a promise that became laughable as British and later American bombers devastated German cities night after night. By 1943 and 1944, the Luftwaffe was being overwhelmed by Allied air forces, losing the war in the skies over Germany itself. Germans suffering under the bombing campaigns blamed Göring, and jokes about him circulated despite the danger of such criticism. Some of these jokes touched on his appearance, his vanity, and by implication, his sexuality, though always carefully coded to avoid prosecution. Göring's relationship with Hitler also provides insight into the question of his sexuality. Though not in the way rumour-mongers might suggest, there was never any credible evidence or even serious speculation about a sexual relationship between Hitler and Göring. Hitler, whose own sexuality has been the subject of much historical debate and who showed little interest in sex generally, related to Göring primarily as a useful subordinate and loyal supporter. Göring, for his part, was utterly devoted to Hitler, treating him with a deference and submission that some observers found servile. This devotion was rooted in political loyalty, shared ideology, and Göring's recognition that his own power derived entirely from Hitler's favour. When Hitler criticised Göring, which became more frequent as the war turned against Germany, Göring would become emotionally distraught, sometimes weeping. This emotional dependency reflected Göring's psychological neediness and his terror of losing his position, not sexual attraction. Nevertheless, the intensity of Göring's need for Hitler's approval invited speculation from those looking for any ammunition to use against him. Another factor that complicated assessments of Göring's sexuality was his drug addiction, which returned periodically throughout his life despite attempts at treatment. The morphine addiction that began with his groin wound in 1923 was followed by treatment in a Swedish sanatorium in 1925 and 1926, where he was briefly committed after violent outbursts. He reduced his usage after this treatment but never fully overcame the addiction. In the late 1930s and 1940s, he used various painkillers and sedatives, and there are accounts of him taking handfuls of pills throughout the day. Paracodeine, a codeine-based medication, became his drug of choice during World War II. This chemical dependency affected his judgment, his mood, and his behavior in ways that made him unreliable and erratic. It also contributed to his weight gain and physical deterioration. For those seeking to understand or explain Göring's personality, his drug use provided a partial explanation for his mood swings, his paranoia, and his disconnection from reality as Germany's military situation collapsed. Some accounts conflated his drug addiction with sexual deviance, viewing both as signs of a degenerate character, though this reflected moral judgment rather than any actual evidence. The question of whether Göring had any same-sex relationships or encounters must be examined against this background of rumour, propaganda, and political backstabbing. What does the actual documentary evidence show? The historical record contains 2 documented heterosexual marriages, both of which appear to have been genuine romantic and sexual relationships. It contains the birth of a biological child. It contains numerous accounts from people who knew Göring personally, none of whom reported any knowledge of same-sex relationships. His extensive correspondence, much of which has been preserved and examined by historians, contains no references to same-sex attraction or relationships. The diaries of his wives, the memoirs of his associates, and the interrogations after his capture all failed to produce any credible evidence of homosexual behaviour. This absence of evidence is itself significant given how thoroughly Göring's life has been examined. However, the absence of evidence is not the same as evidence of absence, and historical methodology requires us to acknowledge what we cannot know with certainty. Could Göring have had secret same-sex encounters that left no documentary trace? It is theoretically possible, just as it is theoretically possible for any historical figure about whom we lack complete information. But possibility is not the same as probability, and responsible history must weight evidence rather than speculation. The burden of proof lies with those making the claim, and in Göring's case, that proof simply doesn't exist in any credible form. What we have instead are rumours that can be explained by political rivalry, propaganda, and the misinterpretation of personality traits that deviated from Nazi masculine ideals without indicating homosexuality. To understand why the rumours persisted and why they continue to surface in popular discussions of Göring, we must recognise that they serve several functions beyond historical accuracy. For some, the question of Göring's sexuality is a way to explore the hypocrisy of the Nazi regime, which persecuted homosexuals while potentially harbouring closeted individuals in its leadership. For others, it is a form of posthumous punishment, as if discovering Göring was homosexual would add an additional layer of condemnation to a man already guilty of monstrous crimes. This reasoning is itself problematic because it implies homosexuality is shameful or discrediting, perpetuating the very prejudices the Nazis themselves promoted. Still others are simply drawn to the sensational and the scandalous, finding the question titillating regardless of the evidence. The psychological complexity of Göring's personality does merit examination, even if it does not support conclusions about his sexual orientation. He was profoundly narcissistic, requiring constant admiration and attention. His self-image was grandiose, viewing himself as a Renaissance prince, a military genius, and a cultural patron, even as reality increasingly contradicted these fantasies. He was also deeply insecure, dependent on Hitler's approval, and devastated by criticism. This combination of grandiosity and insecurity is characteristic of narcissistic personality disorder, and it explains many of his behaviors that might otherwise seem puzzling. His obsession with uniforms and appearance was not about sexual identity, but about his need to present an impressive image to the world and to himself. His collecting of art, jewels, and luxuries was not about refined taste, but about accumulation as a form of ego validation. His emotional volatility, swinging between jovial bonhomie and explosive rage, reflected the fragility of his self-esteem rather than internal conflict about sexuality. Göring's relationship with power and violence also reveals much about his character. Despite his cultivated image as a sophisticated art collector and bon vivant, he was personally responsible for immense cruelty and murder. He established the first concentration camps, created the Gestapo, and signed innumerable death warrants. He was instrumental in the persecution of Jews, ordering their exclusion from economic life, and later participating in the machinery of genocide. At the Nuremberg trials, prosecutors documented his role in the establishment of concentration camps, the suppression of political opposition, the plundering of occupied territories, and the slave labor programs that worked millions to death. He bore direct responsibility for the strategic bombing of civilian targets, including the destruction of Guernica during the Spanish Civil War, an event that shocked the world and foreshadowed the horrors of aerial bombardment in World War II. This capacity for violence and brutality coexisted with his vanity and his emotional attachments to his wives and daughter, creating a compartmentalized personality that could be simultaneously loving and monstrous. The intersection of Göring's personal vanity with Nazi ideology's emphasis on appearance and racial purity created contradictions he never resolved. The Nazi movement was obsessed with physical fitness, martial prowess, and Aryan aesthetics, yet Göring became increasingly corpulent and soft as the years passed. Hitler himself occasionally made cutting remarks about Göring's weight and indulgent lifestyle, though never in ways that threatened their relationship. Other Nazi leaders were less restrained. Goebbels' diary entries drip with contempt for Göring, describing him as bloated, lazy, incompetent, and living in luxury while ordinary Germans suffered. These criticisms intensified as the war turned against Germany and Göring's failures as Luftwaffe commander became undeniable. Yet even Goebbels, who would have gleefully recorded any evidence of sexual scandal about his rival, never suggested homosexuality in his extensive diary entries about Göring. The accusations he levelled were about greed, incompetence, and cowardice, not sexual deviance, which suggests that even someone motivated to destroy Göring's reputation found no credible evidence to support such claims. The issue of Göring's masculinity versus his effeminate mannerisms requires careful historical contextualization. Standards of masculine appearance and behavior vary across time and culture, and behaviors that might seem effeminate in one context may be perfectly normative in another. European aristocratic culture, which Göring affected to belong to despite his middle-class origins, had long traditions of male attention to appearance that would seem elaborate by modern standards. Officers of the old imperial army were expected to be impeccably groomed and to take pride in their uniforms. The use of grooming products, attention to one's appearance, and even certain theatrical gestures were not considered unmasculine in that context. What made Göring exceptional was not that he attended to his appearance, but the extreme degree to which he did so, creating dozens of elaborate uniforms, changing clothes multiple times daily, and eventually becoming so heavy that his vanity seemed absurd. His behavior represented an excess of aristocratic affectation, rather than a violation of gender norms per se, though by Nazi standards of harsh Spartan masculinity, he was certainly an outlier. Some contemporary observers tried to reconcile Göring's contradictory nature through psychological analysis. American psychologist Gustav Gilbert, who had extensive access to Göring and other Nazi leaders during the Nuremberg trials, found him to be intelligent, charismatic, and utterly without conscience regarding his crimes. Gilbert administered Rorschach tests and conducted numerous interviews, producing one of the most detailed psychological profiles of Göring available. In his book Nuremberg Diary, Gilbert describes Göring as manipulative, grandiose, and emotionally shallow despite his apparent charm. Gilbert noted Göring's need for admiration and his skill at reading and manipulating others. However, Gilbert's professional assessment made no suggestion of homosexuality or sexual confusion. Instead, he identified Göring as a narcissistic personality whose grandiosity and lack of empathy enabled him to commit atrocities while maintaining his self-image as a cultured gentleman. This psychological profile, based on direct clinical observation, focused on personality disorders that explained Göring's behavior without invoking sexual orientation as a factor. The role of art collecting in Göring's life also deserves examination, as some have attempted to read sexual meaning into his aesthetic choices. Göring amassed one of the largest private art collections in history, second only to Hitler's planned Führermuseum. He used his position to loot museums, private collections, and Jewish-owned galleries across occupied Europe, shipping trainloads of masterpieces to Karen Hall and his other residences. His collection included works by Rubens, Rembrandt, Vermeer, and countless other masters. The acquisition of this art was motivated primarily by greed, status-seeking, and megalomania, rather than genuine connoisseurship. Göring had limited understanding of art history and made selections based on impressive size, famous names, and immediate visual impact rather than artistic merit or aesthetic coherence. Some observers have suggested that his love of Baroque art, with its fleshy nudes and dramatic sensuality, revealed something about his sexuality, but this reasoning is tenuous at best. The Baroque masters were simply the most prestigious and valuable artists available, making them obvious targets for someone using art as a status symbol. Reading sexual meaning into aesthetic preferences requires interpretive leaps unsupported by evidence. Göring's behavior during the final years of World War II, as Germany's situation became desperate, provides another window into his personality and priorities. As the Allied bombing campaign intensified and the Luftwaffe failed to stop it, Göring retreated increasingly into denial and fantasy. He spent less time in Berlin and more at Karen Hall, surrounding himself with luxury even as German cities burned. He continued to acquire art and treasures even in 1944 and early 1945, using SS units to loot collections from Italy and other occupied territories. His detachment from reality became so severe that military officers complained about his unavailability and his refusal to face facts about the deteriorating military situation. Hitler grew increasingly frustrated with Göring's failures and began to rely more on other advisors. The personal relationship between Hitler and Göring, which had been warm in the early years, cooled considerably as defeat approached. Göring's emotional dependency on Hitler's approval made this withdrawal devastating for him psychologically, contributing to his increased drug use and his further retreat from responsibility. The end of Göring's privileged position came suddenly on April 23, 1945, as the Soviet army approached. Berlin and Hitler prepared for his final stand in the Führerbunker. Göring, who had fled to Bavaria, sent a telegram to Hitler requesting permission to assume leadership of the Reich, as was his right as Hitler's designated successor, given that Hitler was now trapped in Berlin. The telegram was carefully worded to be respectful, but Heinrich Himmler and Martin Bormann, both of whom despised Göring, convinced Hitler that this was an attempted coup. Hitler, in a rage, stripped Göring of all ranks and positions and ordered his arrest. SS guards placed Göring and his family under house arrest at his Bavarian residence. This sudden fall from power, after years at Hitler's side, was the final blow to Göring's delusions of grandeur. When American forces arrived days later, Göring surrendered to them, apparently believing that as a senior military officer he would be treated with a certain protocol. He could not have been more wrong about what awaited him. The Americans who took Göring into custody on May 9, 1945, found him still in possession of a substantial supply of paracodeine pills and initially allowed him to continue taking them. Over the following weeks, as he was moved to various interrogation centers, Allied authorities began to withdraw his access to drugs, forcing him into detoxification. This process was medically supervised but uncomfortable, and Göring's weight dropped rapidly as his metabolism adjusted. The bloated, drug-addled figure who had surrendered transformed over several months into a more alert, thinner version of his younger self. His interrogators noted that, as he detoxified, his intelligence and quick wit became more apparent, though his moral blindness to his crimes remained absolute. He showed no remorse for the millions who had died because of Nazi policies he had helped create and implement. Instead, he defended his actions, claimed he had been following orders or acting for Germany's benefit, and positioned himself as a soldier and statesman rather than a criminal. The Nuremberg trials, which began on November 20th, 1945, placed Göring and 23 other major Nazi figures in the dock to face charges of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. Göring was the most senior Nazi leader to face trial, as Hitler, Himmler, and Goebbels had all committed suicide. He immediately established himself as the de facto leader of the defendants, coaching others on their testimony, maintaining a united front of denial and attempting to use the trial as a platform for Nazi ideology. His intelligence and force of personality made him a formidable presence in the courtroom, despite being a defendant in chains. American prosecutor Robert Jackson found Göring a difficult witness to cross-examine, as he was evasive, argumentative, and skilled at deflecting questions. British prosecutor Sir Hartley Shawcross later remarked that Göring defended himself brilliantly within the constraints of defending the indefensible. Throughout the 8-month trial, no evidence was presented, no testimony was given, and no questions were asked about Göring's sexuality. In a proceeding that examined every aspect of his life and actions in exhaustive detail, producing thousands of pages of testimony and documentary evidence, the question simply did not arise as relevant to the charges or to understanding his role in Nazi crimes. If there had been credible evidence of homosexual relationships or behaviour, one might have expected it to surface during this intensive investigation, particularly given that the prosecution was building a case about moral bankruptcy and the defence was attempting to establish character. The silence on this topic in the Nuremberg record is telling. What was extensively documented was Göring's role in establishing the concentration camp system, his participation in the plunder of occupied territories, his knowledge of and participation in the Holocaust, and his direction of strategic bombing campaigns targeting civilians. The prosecution presented evidence that Göring had chaired the infamous Wannsee Conference planning meeting in 1942, though this was incorrect. Reinhard Heydrich had chaired that particular meeting. However, Göring had issued earlier directives ordering the economic exclusion of Jews, and had been involved in planning what the Nazis euphemistically called the final solution to the Jewish question. Documents bearing his signature authorized actions that led directly to genocide. He had personally ordered the confiscation of Jewish property, the marking of Jews with yellow stars, and their exclusion from German economic life. While he had not personally operated gas chambers or shot civilians into mass graves, his administrative role in creating the machinery of murder was undeniable. The trial's evidence made clear that Göring had been a principal architect of the Holocaust, not merely a bystander. Göring's defense strategy was to accept responsibility for military actions while denying knowledge of the worst atrocities and claiming he had been following Hitler's orders and working for Germany's national interest. He maintained that, as a soldier, he had fought for his country and that the victors were now writing the laws to criminalize the losing side. This argument had some resonance given the novelty of the legal concepts being applied. Crimes against peace and crimes against humanity were new formulations in international law. However, the overwhelming evidence of deliberate mass murder and the systematic nature of Nazi atrocities made such legalistic arguments seem hollow. The judges were not persuaded that following orders or serving one's country justified genocide, torture, and aggressive war. During his time in captivity and trial, Göring's daily routine and behaviour were closely monitored, producing yet another set of observations from people who spent extensive time with him. The prison psychologist Gustave Gilbert, the guards, the interrogators, and his fellow defendants all left accounts of his personality and behaviour. These accounts describe vanity, arrogance, manipulation, and attempts at humour, but again, no credible observer reported anything suggesting homosexual behaviour or attraction. Göring flirted mildly with female translators and nurses, joked with guards, and maintained a heterosexual presentation consistent with his earlier life. He spoke of his wife Emmy and daughter Edda with apparent affection, though cynics noted he had shown more genuine emotion about the loss of his art collection than about the fate of his family. The Nuremberg verdicts were announced on October 1, 1946. Göring was found guilty on all 4 counts: conspiracy to commit crimes against peace, planning and initiating wars of aggression, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. He was sentenced to death by hanging. This method of execution was particularly calculated to humiliate the condemned men, as hanging was considered a common criminal's death rather than the military execution by firing squad that Göring felt he deserved as a former officer. He immediately petitioned the court to be shot instead, arguing that as a soldier he should receive a soldier's death. The petition was denied. In the early hours of October 15, 1946, just hours before he was scheduled to hang, Göring committed suicide by swallowing a cyanide capsule he had hidden on his person. How he obtained the poison and managed to conceal it through months of imprisonment remains unclear. Some theories suggest a sympathetic guard smuggled it to him, others that he had hidden it so cleverly it was never found in searches, still others that it was concealed in a fountain pen or other innocent object. Göring's suicide denied the Allies the satisfaction of executing him, but also demonstrated his continued determination to control his own narrative and fate. In a final note left behind, he wrote that he wanted to be remembered as a soldier who died for his country, not a criminal executed by his enemies. This delusion, this inability to recognize the moral enormity of what he had done, characterized him to the very end. His body was photographed as evidence of death, then cremated, and his ashes were scattered in a river to prevent any grave from becoming a shrine for Nazi sympathizers. Emmy Göring, who had been imprisoned and then released, lived until 1973, maintaining until her death that her husband had been a great man, unjustly condemned. Their daughter Edda, who was 8 years old when her father died, grew up bearing the weight of that legacy. She later claimed her father's art collection, or what remained of it after Allied restitution efforts, and fought legal battles for decades over looted artworks. The question of Göring's sexuality did not die with him, but instead became part of the mythology and speculation that surrounds Nazi leaders in popular culture. In the decades after World War II, as historians, journalists, and the general public sought to understand how the Holocaust and Nazi crimes had been possible, there was a tendency to view the perpetrators as aberrant, deviant, and fundamentally different from normal people. This psychological distancing served a purpose. If the Nazis were monsters, then ordinary people need not examine their own capacity for evil. In this context, any suggestion of sexual deviance became part of the narrative of Nazi depravity. If Göring or other Nazi leaders were homosexual, despite persecuting homosexuals, this hypocrisy would add another layer to their monstrousness and perhaps make them easier to comprehend as fundamentally twisted individuals rather than as products of specific historical and social conditions. However, this approach to understanding the Nazi perpetrators is historically problematic. The uncomfortable truth that scholars like Hannah Arendt explored, in her concept of the banality of evil, is that the people who committed atrocities were often ordinary individuals shaped by ideology, circumstance, and systemic structures of power. They were not necessarily sexual deviants, madmen, or obviously monstrous figures. Göring himself, despite his many flaws and his narcissistic personality disorder, was not psychotic or insane in a clinical sense. He knew right from wrong. He simply chose evil because it served his purposes and because Nazi ideology provided justification for his actions. Focusing on speculation about his sexuality misses this crucial point and potentially allows us to avoid confronting the more troubling reality that people who seem normal in many ways can become mass murderers under the right circumstances. The historiography of Nazi sexuality itself has evolved significantly over the decades. Early post-war accounts often accepted Allied propaganda at face value and repeated rumours without critical examination. The 1950s and 1960s saw sensationalist books about Nazi leaders that traded in gossip and unverified claims. As academic history professionalized its approach to the Third Reich in the 1970s and 1980s, scholars became more rigorous about evidence and more skeptical of propaganda sources. The opening of archives in former communist countries after 1989 provided new documentation, and none of it substantiated claims about Göring's homosexuality. Recent historiography, informed by gender studies and queer theory, has examined the relationship between Nazi ideology and sexuality in more sophisticated ways, exploring how the regime weaponized sexuality, how it persecuted sexual minorities, and how sexual rumors functioned as political tools. This scholarship reinforces the understanding that rumors about Nazi leaders' sexuality must be examined critically and contextualized within propaganda and political rivalry. The specific case of Ernst Röhm is instructive for understanding the difference between documented homosexuality and rumoured homosexuality among Nazi leaders. Röhm's homosexuality was known to those around him, documented in police files from the Weimar era, and acknowledged even by Nazi sources after his murder. There were witnesses to his relationships, correspondence that referenced his sexual orientation, and a pattern of behavior that was consistent with being a closeted or semi-closeted homosexual in that era. Applying the same evidentiary standards to Göring produces no similar documentation. The contrast is stark. Where Röhm left a trail of evidence despite attempts at discretion, Göring left only heterosexual relationships and rumour. This difference matters for historical methodology. If we accept rumours about Göring despite lack of evidence while acknowledging Röhm based on documentation, we would be applying inconsistent standards that privilege speculation over fact. Another comparison worth making is with other Nazi leaders who face similar accusations without evidence. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust and head of the SS, was rumoured to be impotent or homosexual by some sources, yet the documentary evidence shows he had a wife, children, and a long-term mistress with whom he fathered more children. Adolf Hitler himself was the subject of extensive speculation about his sexuality, with claims ranging from homosexuality to asexuality to various paraphilias. Yet the most thorough historical research suggests he had conventional, if perhaps limited, heterosexual relationships with several women. Joseph Goebbels, despite being a serial adulterer who fathered 7 children with his wife and had numerous affairs, faced occasional whispered accusations because of his physical disability and his early bohemian lifestyle. The pattern is clear. Senior Nazis faced accusations about sexual deviance regardless of actual evidence because such accusations served political purposes and satisfied a psychological need to view them as deviant in every way. The role of Soviet propaganda in shaping post-war narratives about Nazi leaders also deserves attention. Soviet intelligence and propaganda organs produced extensive material about Nazi personalities, some of it based on genuine intelligence, but much of it fabricated or exaggerated. The Soviets had their own ideological reasons for portraying Nazi leaders as morally degenerate in every possible way, and sexual accusations were a standard tool. Some of the rumours about Göring that circulated in the post-war period can be traced to Soviet sources, though these must be viewed with the same skepticism applied to all Cold War propaganda. The Soviets also attempted to use captured documents and testimony from German prisoners to build cases against Nazi leaders, but again, no credible evidence of Göring's homosexuality emerged from these efforts, despite the Soviets having every incentive to publicize such information if it existed. We must also consider the cultural context of how sexuality and gender presentation were understood in the era we are examining. The mid-20th century had rigid gender norms and a limited vocabulary for discussing sexual identity. Homosexuality was medicalized as a disorder, criminalized in most countries, and deeply stigmatized. In this environment, any man who deviated from strict masculine norms in his appearance or manner might be labeled homosexual regardless of his actual sexual behavior. Göring's vanity, his attention to grooming, his love of costume and display, his emotional expressiveness, and his theatrical gestures all violated mid-century masculine ideals. In the crude psychological and cultural framework of that era, such violations of gender norms were often interpreted as signs of homosexuality. Modern understanding recognizes that gender expression and sexual orientation are separate dimensions of identity, and that there is no reliable correlation between how masculine or feminine someone appears and who they are attracted to sexually. Applying this more sophisticated understanding to the historical record makes clear that Göring's personality and presentation do not constitute evidence about his sexuality. The question of historical privacy and what we can and should claim to know about historical figures' intimate lives is also relevant. Even when abundant evidence exists about someone's public actions, their private sexual behavior may leave little documentary trace, particularly in eras when such matters were considered deeply private and when certain sexual behaviors were criminal. Historians must acknowledge the limits of what can be known with certainty while still maintaining standards of evidence. In Göring's case, the question is not whether we can definitively prove he never had a same-sex encounter. Proving a negative is logically impossible. Rather, the question is whether sufficient positive evidence exists to support the claim that he was homosexual or bisexual. That evidence does not exist in credible form. What we have are 2 documented heterosexual marriages, biological fatherhood, and the absence of any credible testimony or documentation supporting claims of same-sex relationships. The psychological dimension of rumours and why they persist also merits consideration. Human psychology includes a tendency toward pattern-seeking and narrative building, sometimes at the expense of factual accuracy. When we encounter a complex historical figure like Göring, our minds seek to construct a coherent explanation for his contradictions. How could someone be simultaneously a brave fighter pilot and a cowardly bully? How could he be a devoted husband and father yet a mass murderer? How could he collect great art while looting it from its rightful owners? How could he present himself as cultured and refined while ordering atrocities? These contradictions create cognitive dissonance that our minds want to resolve. For some, speculation about hidden sexuality becomes a way to explain the contradictions. Perhaps his public persona was all performance, hiding his true self. This psychological need for coherent explanations can lead us to accept rumours that provide satisfying narratives even when evidence does not support them. The modern proliferation of claims about Göring's sexuality through internet forums, popular history books and documentaries has created a kind of circular confirmation. When someone encounters the question, "Was Göring gay?" they may search for information and find numerous sources repeating the claim, or treating it as an open question. This repetition creates the impression of credibility even when the original sources are weak or non-existent. Each retelling may add details or present speculation as fact, until a rumour that began as wartime propaganda becomes accepted as historical possibility. This phenomenon is not unique to questions about Göring, but affects many historical topics where sensational claims spread more readily than careful rebuttals. The responsibility of historians and educators is to push back against this tendency by insisting on evidence and by explaining how rumours originate and spread. The ethical dimension of discussing historical figures' sexuality, particularly in cases where evidence is lacking, also deserves reflection. There is nothing shameful about being homosexual or bisexual, yet accusations of homosexuality have historically been used as weapons to demean and discredit people. When we ask whether Göring was gay, we must be aware that this question carries historical weight and contemporary implications. For members of the LGBTQ community, the perpetuation of rumours about Nazi leaders being secretly gay can be harmful because it reinforces associations between homosexuality and evil. The Nazis murdered thousands of gay men in concentration camps, and the idea that their leaders might have been closeted homosexuals adds a painful layer of hypocrisy and tragedy to that history. At the same time, we must be able to discuss historical facts about sexuality openly and honestly when such facts exist, as in the case of Ernst Röhm. The key is distinguishing between evidence-based historical inquiry and speculation that serves no purpose beyond sensationalism. Some defenders of the speculation about Göring's sexuality argue that exploring such questions is valuable because it reveals Nazi hypocrisy and the ways the regime policed sexuality while potentially harbouring sexual diversity in its leadership. This argument has merit in the abstract but fails in Göring's specific case because there is no credible evidence to support it. The hypocrisy argument works for documented cases like Röhm, where a homosexual man led a movement that would later persecute homosexuals. It does not work for cases built on rumour and personality interpretation. If anything, the persistence of unfounded rumours about Göring's sexuality reveals more about our own society's assumptions and prejudices than about Nazi Germany's contradictions. We live in an era more accepting of sexual diversity than mid-20th century Europe, yet we still encounter impulses to use sexuality as a form of judgment and to conflate gender expression with sexual orientation. The academic literature on Göring, which is extensive, generally treats the question of his sexuality as resolved by the documentary evidence of his heterosexual relationships. Biographers such as Richard Overy in Göring, Hitler's Iron Knight examine his personality, his crimes, his relationship with Hitler, his role in the Holocaust, and his trial at Nuremberg without finding any credible basis for claims about homosexuality. Overy's biography, based on exhaustive research in German and Allied archives, presents Göring as a narcissistic, greedy, power-hungry individual whose personality disorders and moral bankruptcy require no additional explanation through speculation about hidden sexuality. Similarly, Werner Maaser's Hermann Göring, Hitler's Janusköpfiger Paladin, and other scholarly works focus on documented facts rather than rumours. The pattern in serious historical scholarship is clear. Claims about Göring's homosexuality are relegated to footnotes as unsubstantiated rumours, if mentioned at all. The role of Göring's first wife, Karin, in shaping our understanding of his emotional life deserves further exploration. Karin's diaries, which her family preserved and eventually published, provide an intimate window into Göring's personality during the critical years of the 1920s. She describes a man capable of great tenderness and passion, but also prone to violent rages and deep depressions. She writes of his jealousy, his need for constant reassurance, his grandiose dreams, and his genuine affection for her. These are not the writings of a woman deceived about the nature of her relationship, but rather someone deeply involved with a complicated man whom she loved despite his flaws. After her death, Göring's grief was profound and public. He built the grand estate of Karin Hall as a monument to her memory, filling it with her portraits and personal belongings. He spoke of her constantly in the years that followed, and associates noted that mentions of Karin could reduce him to tears. This sustained devotion over more than a decade after her death, in private contexts where there was no need for performance, suggests genuine heterosexual romantic love rather than a cover for hidden sexuality. Emmy Göring's role in the final years of his life also provides evidence worth considering. As the war turned against Germany and Göring's position became increasingly precarious, Emmy remained with him, eventually fleeing to Bavaria as Soviet forces approached Berlin. She was present when American troops arrived and witnessed his surrender. During his imprisonment and trial, she visited when permitted and maintained her loyalty despite the overwhelming evidence of his crimes. After his suicide, she faced denazification proceedings herself and served time in prison for her activities during the Nazi era. Yet, throughout her long widowhood, which lasted until her death in 1973, she never suggested that her marriage had been anything other than conventional. In her memoir, My Life with Göring, published in 1967, she portrayed their relationship as a genuine love match between a man and woman, describing their intimate life in ways consistent with a heterosexual marriage. While her account is certainly biased in favour of presenting Göring sympathetically, it would have been unnecessary to fabricate details about their private life decades after his death if the reality had been different. The question of what Göring himself said or wrote about sexuality provides additional evidence. His letters, speeches, and recorded conversations have been preserved and examined by historians. In none of these materials does he express same-sex attraction or make comments that would suggest homosexual orientation. His recorded conversations with fellow prisoners at Nuremberg, his testimony during the trial, and his final statements all maintain a consistent heterosexual presentation. Göring was not a man known for his restraint or his ability to keep secrets about himself. His narcissism led him to talk constantly about his achievements, his possessions, his family, and his ideas. If he had harboured secret sexual desires, it seems unlikely he could have maintained perfect silence about them across thousands of pages of documented statements and conversations, especially during the stressful circumstances of imprisonment and trial, when psychological defences often break down. The broader context of male relationships in military and political settings also helps us understand why Göring's close friendships with other men should not be interpreted as evidence of homosexuality. Military culture, particularly in the officer corps of early 20th century Europe, fostered intense male bonding through shared danger, hierarchy, and tradition. Fighter pilots in World War I lived and died together, celebrating victories and mourning losses in tightly knit squadrons. These friendships were emotionally intense by design and by circumstance, but they existed within a framework of acceptable masculine behaviour that did not carry sexual connotations. Göring maintained lifelong friendships with fellow pilots from World War I, corresponded with them, met with them when possible, and reminisced about their shared experiences. These relationships were important to him emotionally, but nothing in the historical record suggests they were sexual in nature. Interpreting all intense male friendship as homosexual is a modern tendency that misreads historical contexts where such friendships were normative. The Nazi leadership itself formed a kind of all-male club where members spent enormous amounts of time together in meetings, social gatherings, and official functions. Hitler preferred the company of his inner circle to that of women, and the leadership group spent many evenings together in long discussions, dinners, and cultural events. These gatherings were homosocial but not homosexual. They reflected Hitler's work habits, his preference for holding forth to an audience, and the exclusion of women from political power in Nazi Germany. Göring attended hundreds of such gatherings over the years, interacting closely with Goebbels, Himmler, Ribbentrop, Speer, and others. The relationships among these men were characterized by rivalry, manipulation, and shifting alliances as each competed for Hitler's favor. Some Nazi leaders genuinely liked each other, others despised each other, but these feelings were about power and personality, rather than sexual attraction. If Göring had shown romantic or sexual interest in any of his male colleagues, such behavior would almost certainly have been noticed and documented by rivals eager to use any ammunition against him. Another aspect worth examining is how Göring's lifestyle and consumption patterns related to his sexuality. His enormous appetite for luxury goods, fine food, wine, art, and every form of material indulgence has been well documented. He operated a massive economic empire built on corruption, taking bribes from industrialists seeking government contracts, skimming funds from state enterprises, and looting occupied territories on a staggering scale. The Hermann Göring Works, a vast industrial conglomerate built on seized businesses, made him one of the wealthiest men in Germany. He used this wealth to live like a Renaissance prince, maintaining multiple residences, a private train, and a lifestyle of almost unimaginable excess, even as ordinary Germans faced rationing and hardship. Some observers have tried to connect this consumption to sublimated sexuality, arguing that his material appetites compensated for unsatisfied sexual desires. This psychoanalytic interpretation, however, requires theoretical leaps unsupported by evidence. The simpler explanation is that Göring was profoundly narcissistic and greedy, using his power to indulge every appetite without restraint or conscience. His relationship with food and his weight gain over the years has also been subjected to interpretive analysis. The young Göring of World War I was lean and fit, conforming to the athletic ideal. By the mid-1930s he had become heavy, and by the 1940s he was obese, his weight exceeding 300 pounds at times. This transformation resulted from multiple factors: his morphine addiction and subsequent treatment, which affected his metabolism, his reduced physical activity as he moved from flying to administrative roles, his access to unlimited food during the Göring dinners where he consumed enormous quantities, and possibly his psychological state as he attempted to fill emotional needs with material consumption. Some armchair psychologists have suggested his weight gain represented a rejection of masculine ideals or a feminization of his body, reading sexual meaning into what was likely metabolic and behavioral. Medical factors provide adequate explanation without needing to invoke theories about sexuality. The specific accusations and rumors about Göring that have circulated over the decades deserve individual examination. One rumor suggested he had affairs with male actors or performers, but no names, dates, or credible witnesses have ever been produced to support this claim. Another rumor involved alleged relationships with members of the Luftwaffe, but again, no documentation exists despite the extensive records kept about Luftwaffe personnel and Göring's activities. Some accounts have claimed that photographs of Göring in costume or theatrical dress prove homosexuality. But this reasoning confuses theatrical self-expression with sexual identity. Göring loved pageantry and often dressed in elaborate hunting costumes, historical uniforms, or ceremonial robes. These were expressions of his vanity and his desire to play various roles, not indicators of sexual orientation. By this logic, anyone who enjoys costume parties or historical reenactment would be suspect, which is obviously absurd. One particularly persistent rumor involves alleged blackmail material that enemies supposedly held over Göring. The theory suggests that Himmler or others possessed evidence of homosexual activity and used it to control Göring. However, this theory contradicts what we know about how power operated in Nazi Germany. If Himmler had possessed genuine blackmail material of such magnitude, he would have used it to destroy Göring entirely, not merely to exert leverage. Himmler was not a subtle political operator who would preserve a rival when he could eliminate him. Moreover, the extensive files of the SS and SD that have been examined by historians contain no such evidence about Göring. The blackmail theory is unsupported speculation that misunderstands Nazi power dynamics. Some claims about Göring's sexuality appear to originate from conflating him with other Nazi figures or from simple misinformation. In popular memory and casual discussion, Nazi leaders sometimes blend together into a general category of Nazi monster, with attributes and accusations transferred between individuals. Ernst Röhm's documented homosexuality, Rudolf Hess's strange flight to Scotland, and subsequent speculation about his mental state and sexuality, various rumours about Hitler himself, these disparate elements sometimes merge into generalized claims that the Nazi leadership was full of homosexuals, or Göring was involved in the gay circle around Hitler. Such claims fail basic historical scrutiny because they rely on vague associations rather than specific documentation. Each historical figure must be evaluated based on evidence specific to them, not on general impressions or guilt by association. The impact of post-war German culture and memory on how Göring has been remembered also shaped the narratives around him. In the immediate post-war period, Germans who had lived through the Nazi era had to construct explanations for how they had allowed or participated in the regime's crimes. One psychological defense was to portray Nazi leaders as fundamentally alien, as monsters so different from ordinary Germans that their rise to power became explicable as a kind of possession or abnormality. In this framework, any form of deviance, sexual, psychological, moral, helped maintain the separation between them, the Nazis, and us, the German people. This defensive need contributed to the acceptance and perpetuation of rumours about Nazi leaders' private lives, including claims about sexuality. If Göring and others were sexual deviants, this marked them as fundamentally other, relieving ordinary Germans of the need to examine their own complicity. The Jewish victims of Nazi persecution and their descendants also had to make sense of the catastrophe that had befallen them. The question, how could human beings do this, has haunted Holocaust survivors and scholars for decades. Various attempts to answer it have included psychological, social, historical, and even spiritual explanations. Some accounts of Nazi leaders emphasize their pathology, their abnormality, their difference from decent human beings. While understandable as a response to trauma, this approach risks missing the disturbing truth that the perpetrators were not monsters from another species, but human beings shaped by ideology, circumstances, and choices. Hannah Arendt's controversial but important concept of the banality of evil challenged the notion that Nazi criminals were extraordinary individuals, instead arguing that ordinary people could commit extraordinary crimes through ideological indoctrination, bureaucratic structures, and moral abdication. This more complex understanding of perpetration does not require or benefit from speculation about the perpetrator's sexuality. The role of Cold War politics in shaping post-war narratives about Nazis also contributed to various rumours and accusations. Both Western and Soviet propaganda apparatuses had interests in portraying Nazis in particular ways. The Soviets, with their official ideology condemning both fascism and homosexuality, sometimes linked the two in propaganda designed for domestic and international audiences. Western intelligence agencies, competing with the Soviets for former Nazi scientists, intelligence assets, and political allies in Germany, also engaged in selective characterization of Nazi figures. Some former Nazis were rehabilitated and presented as professional military men who had been caught up in evil beyond their control, while others were demonized as fanatics and deviants. Where individuals fell in this spectrum often depended on their usefulness to Cold War objectives rather than on careful historical assessment. Göring, who died before he could be useful to either side, received less rehabilitation than some, but also less systematic demonization than others. The psychological profiles compiled by Allied intelligence during and after the war provide another source of information about Göring. Multiple psychiatrists and psychologists examined him, most notably during his captivity at Nuremberg. These professionals, working within the theoretical frameworks of 1940s psychiatry, attempted to understand his personality and motivations. Their reports described narcissistic traits, grandiosity, lack of empathy, manipulativeness, and other characteristics consistent with personality disorders. Some analysts speculated about childhood experiences and family dynamics that might have contributed to his adult personality. However, none of these professional assessments concluded that Göring was homosexual or struggling with sexual identity. If trained mental health professionals examining him intensively found no evidence of homosexuality, this absence is significant. While 1940s psychiatry had its biases and limitations, professionals of that era were often quick to diagnose homosexuality when they believed they saw signs of it. The fact that they did not do so in Göring's case suggests that even to observers looking through a homophobic lens, he did not present as homosexual. The testimonies of people who worked closely with Göring on a daily basis also failed to support claims about homosexuality. His secretaries, adjutants, household staff, and administrative personnel left various accounts of their time in his service. These accounts describe his work habits, his temper, his treatment of subordinates, his daily routines, and his personal quirks. Several describe his attention to his appearance and his frequent costume changes. None report any inappropriate sexual behavior with men or any indications that he was sexually interested in men. While servants and subordinates might have been reluctant to report sexual misconduct, and while some might have protected his reputation after the fact, the complete absence of such accounts across dozens of different sources is noteworthy. In other cases, where powerful men engaged in secret same-sex relationships, evidence typically emerges from those in their orbit. Lovers, rejected advances, servants who observe behavior, rumors among staff. The absence of any such evidence in Göring's case, despite the enormous number of people who interacted with him over decades, is telling. The counter-argument that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence has some validity in historical inquiry. We cannot know with absolute certainty what happened in moments that were not documented or witnessed. However, historical methodology requires us to proportion our beliefs to the evidence available. When extensive documentation exists about someone's life, when multiple independent sources converge on a consistent picture, and when absence of evidence extends across decades and hundreds of witnesses, we must conclude that the probability of undocumented secret behavior is low. In Göring's case, we have more documentation than exists for almost any historical figure. Thousands of letters, diary entries by people who knew him, official records, trial transcripts, interrogation reports, photographs, films, and contemporary accounts. This massive documentary record consistently shows heterosexual relationships and provides no credible evidence of homosexuality. To insist that he nevertheless might have been secretly gay requires either evidence that has not yet been found or a willingness to prioritize speculation over documentation. The comparison with historical figures whose sexuality has been credibly established through documentary evidence is instructive. When historians have concluded that historical figures were gay or bisexual, they typically base such conclusions on multiple types of evidence. Personal correspondence expressing romantic or sexual feelings toward people of the same sex, testimonies from contemporaries who knew about relationships, patterns of living arrangements or financial support consistent with same-sex partnerships, coded language in diaries or letters that can be interpreted with knowledge of historical gay subcultures, or, in more recent cases, the individual's own statements about their sexuality. Examples include figures like Michelangelo, Oscar Wilde, Virginia Woolf, James Baldwin, and many others whose sexuality has been established through careful historical research. In each case, positive evidence exists beyond mere speculation or personality analysis. The evidentiary standards applied to these cases should also apply to Göring, and by those standards, the claim that he was gay or bisexual fails. The question of what constitutes homosexuality itself has evolved over time, and this evolution affects how we analyze historical figures. Contemporary understanding recognizes sexual orientation as existing on a spectrum, with categories including gay, bisexual, queer, and many other identities. Historical periods had different frameworks for understanding same-sex attraction and behavior. In some eras and cultures, sexual behavior that today would be categorized as homosexual was understood differently, without creating a distinct sexual identity. The concept of the homosexual as a type of person, rather than someone who engages in certain acts, is relatively modern, emerging in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. When we ask whether historical figures were gay, we must be careful not to anachronistically impose modern identity categories on people who lived in different frameworks. However, by the time Göring lived in the early to mid-20th century, the modern concept of homosexual identity existed, as evidenced by the Weimar era's relatively visible gay subculture, the medical literature on homosexuality, and the Nazi persecution of homosexuals. If Göring had experienced same-sex attraction, he would have lived in a context where that experience could be understood and conceptualized, even if it had to be hidden for social and political reasons. The role of coded language and symbols in historical gay communities also provides an analytical tool. LGBTQ people living in hostile or dangerous environments have often developed coded ways of signaling identity and attraction, from specific words and phrases to clothing choices, colors, and symbols. Historians studying gay history look for evidence of individuals participating in these codes. Ernst Röhm, for instance, was part of the relatively open gay subculture in 1920s Munich, frequenting certain establishments and associating with known gay men. There is no evidence that Göring participated in any such subculture, used coded language, or associated with known gay social circles. His socializing was conducted in highly visible public settings: state dinners, official functions, hunting parties at Hall, rather than in the kinds of private or semi-secret venues where closeted individuals might have felt safer. His public persona and his private life, as documented by those around him, appear consistent rather than contradictory, suggesting no double life that would need to be hidden. The question of whether repression and denial could explain the lack of evidence must also be addressed. Could Göring have so thoroughly repressed any homosexual feelings that they left no trace? Psychological theory recognizes that people can repress unwanted feelings and desires, sometimes to the point of being genuinely unaware of them consciously. However, complete repression, leaving absolutely no behavioral traces, is difficult to maintain over an entire lifetime, especially under stress. People who are deeply closeted typically show some behavioral indicators: avoidance of intimacy with opposite-sex partners, patterns of same-sex friendships that exceed normal bonding, emotional reactions to discussions of homosexuality, sublimated expressions of desire in art or writing, or psychological distress from the internal conflict. Göring showed none of these patterns in any documented form. His heterosexual relationships appear to have been active and genuine, his friendships with men appear to have been conventional, and his attitudes toward homosexuality as expressed in his official role enforcing anti-gay policies show no particular emotional investment beyond standard Nazi ideology. The enforcement of paragraph 175 and the persecution of homosexuals under Göring's authority provides another angle for analysis. As Minister-President of Prussia and head of the Prussian police in the early Nazi period, Göring had administrative responsibility for some of the persecution of gay men. The Gestapo, which he initially controlled, arrested thousands under paragraph 175. While he later transferred the Gestapo to Himmler, and while he personally showed more interest in economic exploitation and art collecting than in sexual policing, he was still part of the system that criminalized and murdered gay men. Some have suggested that if Göring were secretly gay, his participation in this persecution would represent internalized homophobia, or the classic pattern of the closeted homophobe attacking others to deflect suspicion from himself. However, this interpretation requires evidence of closeted homosexuality in the first place. Without such evidence, Göring's participation in persecution of gay men simply makes him complicit in one of many Nazi crimes rather than evidence of psychological projection. The medical and physical evidence also provides some relevant information. Göring's health was extensively documented, particularly during his imprisonment when he underwent detoxification and medical examinations. Doctors examined him thoroughly, treated his various ailments, and documented his physical condition. There is no indication in these medical records of conditions that would have affected his sexual function in ways that might have led to homosexuality as an alternative. His groin wound from 1923, while painful and requiring extensive treatment, apparently did not cause permanent sexual dysfunction, as evidenced by his subsequent marriage and biological fatherhood. His obesity and drug use in later years may have affected his libido and sexual function, but these conditions developed well after his marriages were established. The medical record provides no support for theories that physical factors led to or expressed homosexual orientation. The cultural products that Göring commissioned, collected, or enjoyed might theoretically provide insight into his desires and identity. His art collection, as mentioned earlier, consisted primarily of Baroque masters and other prestigious works chosen more for their value and impressive quality than for any particular aesthetic or thematic program. He did not collect homoerotic art or works that would today be recognized as gay cultural products. His interest in Wagner's operas, which he shared with Hitler and much of the Nazi leadership, reflected their nationalist themes rather than any interest in the homoeroticism that some modern critics find in Wagner. He enjoyed hunting and displayed his trophies, participating in a traditionally masculine pastime without apparent irony or subversion. His clothing choices, while elaborate and vain, followed patterns of military and aristocratic dress rather than crossing gender boundaries or adopting styles associated with gay subcultures. In short, his cultural consumption and production showed no signs of coded gay identity or interests. One must also consider the question from the perspective of what would have been required for Göring to maintain a completely secret gay life. In Nazi Germany, homosexual men who wished to engage in same-sex relationships had to take significant risks. They might frequent certain bars or bathhouses, develop networks of trust with other gay men, or maintain long-term partnerships that had to be carefully hidden. Each of these activities would have created potential exposure. For someone in Göring's position, constantly in the public eye, surrounded by rivals seeking dirt on him, protected and monitored by security services, and living in a regime that actively persecuted homosexuals, maintaining a secret gay life would have been extraordinarily difficult, if not impossible. The risk of blackmail, exposure, and political destruction would have been immense. While some high-ranking individuals have managed to lead double lives despite intense scrutiny, they typically leave some traces: a trusted confidant who later reveals the secret, financial records of payments to lovers or establishments, letters that survive in private collections, or deathbed revelations. In Göring's case, none of these traces exist despite decades of intensive historical research. The politics of memory and representation in the post-war period also affected how Göring has been portrayed. Various groups and interests have had reasons to portray him in particular ways. Some works of fiction, film, and popular history have taken liberties with historical figures, adding dramatic elements that lack factual basis. Göring has appeared as a character in numerous films and television series about World War II and the Nazis, and some of these portrayals have emphasized his vanity and effeminacy in ways that suggest or imply homosexuality without stating it directly. These fictional portrayals, while often based on historical research, are not bound by the same evidentiary standards as academic history. They can and do take dramatic license, creating composite characters, inventing dialogue, and adding elements that make for compelling drama, but may not be historically accurate. When these fictional portrayals then inform popular understanding of historical figures, a feedback loop can develop where dramatized speculation begins to be remembered as fact. The contemporary political context in which questions about Nazi sexuality arise also shapes how such questions are received and interpreted. In our current era, when LGBTQ rights have advanced significantly in many countries, and when discussion of sexuality is more open than in previous generations, there is sometimes a tendency toward what might be called retrospective outing. The desire to identify historical figures as gay or bisexual, partly to establish a longer history of LGBTQ presence, and partly out of curiosity about past sexualities. This impulse is understandable, and has led to important historical research recovering the stories of LGBTQ individuals who were erased or hidden in earlier accounts. However, it must be balanced against rigorous evidentiary standards. Claiming someone was gay without adequate evidence does not serve LGBTQ history, it simply perpetuates speculation. Moreover, in the specific case of Nazi leaders, retrospective outing can have the harmful effect of linking homosexuality with evil in popular imagination. The importance of distinguishing between different types of historical claims cannot be overstated. There is a vast difference between saying Göring was gay as a statement of fact, Göring may have been gay as a hypothesis worth investigating, and some people have speculated Göring was gay, but there is no credible evidence supporting this claim, as an accurate description of the historiographical situation. Responsible history requires making these distinctions clear. The first claim is unsupported by evidence and should not be made. The second claim might have been worth investigating decades ago, when archives were less thoroughly explored, but given the extensive research since then without yielding supporting evidence, the hypothesis has effectively been tested and found wanting. The third claim is the most accurate representation of where historical scholarship stands, acknowledging that rumours exist while making clear they lack evidential support. The role of entertainment media in shaping public understanding of history provides another layer to this discussion. Films, television series, novels, and video games set during World War II often feature Nazi characters, including Göring. These portrayals vary widely in historical accuracy, with some productions employing historical consultants and striving for accuracy, while others take substantial dramatic license. When these works portray Göring as effeminate, vain, or coded as gay through various signals, they may be drawing on historical descriptions of his personality, or they may be embellishing for dramatic effect. Audiences who encounter these fictionalized versions may not distinguish between historically documented traits and dramatic invention. A portrayal that emphasizes Göring's vanity and makeup used based on historical accounts might still create an impression of homosexuality through performance choices, cinematography, or dialogue that goes beyond what evidence supports. The responsibility for maintaining historical accuracy in such works ultimately lies with creators, but audiences also bear some responsibility for recognizing the difference between historical fiction and historical fact. The question of intentionality versus interpretation also merits discussion. Even if we accept that Göring exhibited behaviors that some interpreted as effeminate, wearing makeup, using perfume, constantly changing elaborate uniforms, displaying emotional volatility, we must ask whether these behaviors were intended to signal homosexuality or were simply expressions of his narcissism and theatricality. Intent matters in understanding historical actions. Göring clearly intended to project power, wealth, and prestige through his appearance. He intended to be noticed, admired, and envied. There is no evidence he intended to signal same-sex attraction or to participate in any coded gay communication. The interpretation of his behavior as indicating homosexuality appears to be imposed by others rather than originating from his own intent or self-understanding. This distinction between how someone understood themselves and how others interpreted them is crucial for accurate historical analysis. The broader question of how we understand the relationship between personality, gender expression, and sexuality in historical context requires sophisticated analysis. Göring lived in an era when gender roles were more rigid than today in some ways, but also when upper-class European culture maintained traditions of male elegance and display that had different connotations than similar behavior would have in other contexts. An aristocratic officer attending to his appearance meticulously was participating in a tradition of noble display, not necessarily violating masculine norms. However, Göring's behavior exceeded even generous interpretations of aristocratic tradition, moving into territory that contemporaries found excessive and that his enemies could use against him. Yet, excessive vanity and effeminate mannerisms are not the same as homosexuality, and conflating them reveals unexamined assumptions about the relationships between these different aspects of identity and presentation. Some have argued that the question itself, was Göring gay, is less interesting than the question of why the rumor persists and what function it serves. This meta-historical approach treats the rumor as a cultural artifact worth studying in its own right, independent of whether it is true. From this perspective, examining why people wanted to believe Göring was gay, how the rumor spread, who repeated it, and in what contexts and what purposes it served becomes the actual historical inquiry. This approach has merit because it shifts focus from an unanswerable question about private sexual behavior to analyzable questions about public discourse, propaganda, and cultural memory. However, this meta-historical approach should not be used as a way to avoid taking a clear position on whether the evidence supports the claim. Historians can both analyze why rumors exist and also state clearly that the rumors lack factual basis. The ethical considerations of discussing any historical figure's sexuality deserve careful attention, particularly when that figure is guilty of monstrous crimes. Some might argue that Göring deserves no protection of his privacy or reputation given his role in genocide and war crimes. While there is something to this argument, why should we care about being fair to someone who was unfair to millions? The answer is that historical accuracy and intellectual integrity matter regardless of the moral character of the person being studied. We do not serve truth or justice by making false claims about anyone, even someone as guilty as Göring. Moreover, false or speculative claims about Göring's sexuality do not harm Göring, who who is long dead, but they can harm living people by perpetuating associations between homosexuality and evil, or by demonstrating that speculation is acceptable when evidence is lacking. Maintaining high standards of historical evidence and reasoning is not about protecting Göring's reputation, but about protecting the integrity of historical discourse itself. The question of what we can learn from this entire discussion extends beyond the specific case of Hermann Göring. This case study in historical methodology demonstrates several important principles: the difference between evidence and rumour, the importance of considering source credibility and motivation, the need to contextualize behavior within its historical and cultural setting, the danger of reading modern categories and assumptions backward into history, and the responsibility to proportion conclusions to evidence. These principles apply broadly across historical inquiry and are worth emphasizing precisely because they are so often violated in popular historical discourse. Göring's case provides an opportunity to demonstrate rigorous historical thinking in action, examining a sensational question, weighing the evidence carefully, acknowledging what can and cannot be known, and reaching a conclusion based on evidence rather than speculation or desired narrative. The fact that this question continues to arise despite the lack of supporting evidence also tells us something about contemporary culture's relationship with history. We live in an era of unprecedented access to information, but also of rampant misinformation. Rumours can spread globally in seconds through social media, and once established in popular consciousness, they are difficult to dislodge even when thoroughly debunked. The question, was Göring gay, persists partly because it is titillating, partly because it confirms certain narratives about Nazi hypocrisy, and partly because sensational claims attract more attention than careful rebuttals. Fighting this tendency requires constant effort from educators, historians, and media producers who prioritize accuracy over engagement metrics. It requires audiences willing to seek out reliable sources and to adjust their beliefs when evidence does not support them. It requires intellectual humility about what we can know and honesty about when we are speculating rather than relying on facts. The trajectory of Göring's reputation over the decades since his death reveals how historical figures can be simultaneously well documented and subject to persistent mythology. In the immediate post-war years, Göring was remembered primarily as a convicted war criminal, the highest-ranking Nazi to face justice at Nuremberg. His role in establishing concentration camps, his participation in the Holocaust, his direction of the Luftwaffe's bombing campaigns, and his massive corruption dominated the historical narrative. Early biographies focused on his crimes and his fall from power, portraying him as a bloated, drug-addicted failure who had betrayed whatever talents he once possessed. As time passed and historical research became more sophisticated, more nuanced portraits emerged that examined his entire life trajectory from decorated war hero to Nazi criminal, trying to understand how someone could contain such contradictions. Yet throughout all of this serious historical work, rumours about his personal life persisted in the margins, occasionally surfacing in popular accounts despite lack of evidentiary support. The transformation of historical research methodology over the past 75 years has provided tools for investigating questions like Göring's sexuality with greater sophistication than was possible immediately after the war. Oral history projects have collected testimonies from thousands of people who lived through the Nazi era, providing first-hand accounts that supplement documentary evidence. Archives in formerly communist countries have opened, revealing intelligence files and captured documents that were previously inaccessible. Computational analysis of large document collections has made it possible to search for patterns that might have been missed in traditional archival research. Interdisciplinary approaches drawing on psychology, sociology, gender studies, and other fields have provided new frameworks for analysing historical figures. All of these methodological advances have been applied to studying the Nazi era in general and major figures like Göring in particular. Yet despite these sophisticated tools and approaches, no credible evidence of Göring's homosexuality has emerged. This absence despite intensive research is itself a form of evidence, not definitive proof of negative, but strong indication that the rumours lack substance. The specific question of how we know anything about historical sexuality deserves deeper exploration. Sexual behaviour typically occurs in private and leaves limited documentary trace. Letters might be destroyed, participants might take secrets to their graves, and evidence might be deliberately concealed. Historians studying historical sexuality must therefore rely on various types of indirect evidence: correspondence that uses coded language, financial records showing payments to lovers or establishments, testimonies from confidants, diaries that record feelings and experiences, and patterns of behavior that suggest relationships. The quality and quantity of such evidence varies greatly between different historical figures and different time periods. For some individuals, we have abundant evidence allowing confident conclusions about their sexual lives. For others, we have fragmentary hints that allow only tentative hypotheses. For still others, we have effectively no evidence beyond speculation. Göring falls into this third category when it comes to homosexuality. Despite abundant documentation about his life generally, no credible evidence of same-sex attraction or relationships exists. The comparative analysis with other Nazi leaders' sexual lives provides useful context. Adolf Hitler's sexuality has been the subject of enormous speculation and analysis, with theories ranging from asexuality to repressed homosexuality to various paraphilias. The best historical evidence suggests he had heterosexual relationships with several women, including Eva Braun, whom he married shortly before their joint suicide. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the Holocaust, was married with children and also maintained a long-term mistress with whom he fathered additional children, suggesting a conventional, if adulterous, heterosexuality. Joseph Goebbels was a notorious womanizer who had numerous affairs despite being married with 7 children. Martin Bormann was also married with children and known for heterosexual relationships. Reinhard Heydrich, one of the main architects of the Holocaust, was married with children and known for both his cruelty and his womanizing. The pattern across senior Nazi leadership is one of documented heterosexual relationships, often conventional marriages with children, combined in some cases with adultery. Ernst Röhm stands out as the documented exception. His homosexuality both known to intimates and eventually used as a justification for his murder. The contrast between the documented evidence about Röhm and the lack of evidence about Göring is instructive. The psychology of belief and why people accept or reject historical claims based on insufficient evidence is also relevant to understanding this case. Cognitive biases affect how we process information about historical figures we already view as evil. Confirmation bias leads us to accept information that confirms existing negative impressions while being skeptical of information that contradicts them. If we already view Göring as a monster, we may be more willing to accept claims about sexual deviance without demanding strong evidence, because such claims fit our existing schema. Conversely, if we are predisposed to reject any claim not supported by solid evidence, we may be overly skeptical even of well-founded historical hypotheses. Navigating these biases requires conscious effort to apply consistent evidentiary standards, regardless of whether claims confirm or challenge our existing beliefs. In Göring's case, the consistent application of normal historical standards leads to rejection of unsupported rumors about his sexuality, not because he deserves any protection or sympathy, but because the evidence simply does not support the claims. The question of historical responsibility and how we represent the past to contemporary audiences carries particular weight when dealing with sensitive topics like sexuality and with figures who committed atrocities. Educators, documentary filmmakers, authors, and others who communicate history to the public have a responsibility to distinguish between evidence and speculation, to acknowledge uncertainty when it exists, and to avoid perpetuating rumors simply because they are interesting or dramatic. This responsibility is perhaps even more acute in the age of internet and social media, where content spreads rapidly and corrections rarely catch up with initial false claims. When someone searches, "Was Göring gay?" they may encounter sources that present speculation as fact, that fail to acknowledge the lack of evidence, or that blur the line between historical inquiry and sensationalism. Those creating content about historical topics have an ethical obligation to maintain accuracy and to make clear when they are speculating, versus reporting documented facts. The intersection of this question with contemporary debates about LGBTQ rights and representation adds another dimension of complexity. On one hand, there is value in recovering LGBTQ history and acknowledging that gay and bisexual people have always existed, including in historical periods and contexts where they face severe persecution. On the other hand, falsely claiming that villainous historical figures were gay, can reinforce harmful stereotypes linking homosexuality with immorality or deviance. The case of the Nazis is particularly fraught because the regime actively persecuted LGBTQ people, while some early Nazi figures like Röhm were themselves gay. This historical reality is important to acknowledge and study. However, extending unsubstantiated speculation to other Nazi leaders like Göring serves no purpose in LGBTQ history or education, and may actually harm by creating false associations. Accurate history serves LGBTQ communities better than exaggerated or false claims about historical figures' sexuality. Some might argue that focusing on this question at all, even to debunk it, gives it more attention than it deserves. There is something to this criticism. Why spend so much time refuting a rumour when we could simply ignore it? The answer is that the rumour persists precisely because it has not been thoroughly addressed in accessible form. When questions continue to be asked, when internet searches continue to return ambiguous or misleading results, there is value in providing a comprehensive, evidence-based answer that people can reference. Moreover, the question provides an opportunity to demonstrate historical methodology and critical thinking in action, showing how historians evaluate evidence, consider sources, contextualize behavior, and reach conclusions. In this sense, examining the Göring sexuality question serves a pedagogical purpose beyond the specific question itself. The role of family members and descendants in shaping narratives about historical figures also deserves consideration. Emmy Göring spent decades after her husband's death trying to rehabilitate his reputation, publishing memoirs that portrayed him as a misunderstood patriot rather than a war criminal. Her daughter Edda, who changed her surname and tried to live away from her father's shadow, nevertheless defended his memory and fought legal battles over his art collection for decades. These family members had both emotional and financial interests in presenting Göring in particular ways, which affects the credibility of their accounts. At the same time, their intimate knowledge of Göring provides information unavailable from other sources. Evaluating testimony from family members requires balancing these competing considerations. They knew things others did not, but they also had biases and motivations that shaped what they chose to reveal or conceal. In the case of Göring's sexuality, neither Emmy nor Edda ever suggested anything other than conventional heterosexuality, even in contexts where they might have used such information if it existed. The broader cultural fascination with Nazi leaders and the evil they perpetrated creates a market for any new or sensational information about them. Publishers, filmmakers, and content creators know that Nazi-themed content attracts audiences, and therefore there is commercial incentive to produce such content even when it pushes boundaries of historical accuracy. Claims about Nazi leaders' personal lives, particularly scandalous or salacious claims, can generate attention and sales. This commercial dynamic means that questionable claims about figures like Göring may continue to circulate not because they are well-founded, but because they are marketable. Resisting this dynamic requires both producer ethics, content creators choosing accuracy over sensationalism, and consumer awareness, audiences learning to distinguish between responsible, history, and exploitation. The question of what standards of evidence should apply to different types of historical claims is worth examining in general terms. When historians make claims about public events, battles, laws, political decisions, they can typically rely on official records, contemporary journalism, and multiple witnesses. These claims can often be verified with high confidence. When they make claims about private behavior, personal relationships, intimate conversations, internal motivations, the evidence is usually thinner and certainty is lower. Responsible historians acknowledge these different levels of certainty and proportion their claims accordingly. For private behavior by high-profile figures like Göring, we should expect multiple independent sources of evidence before accepting claims as established fact. A single, uncorroborated rumour, even if repeated many times, does not meet this standard. Multiple rumours from sources with clear bias or motivation to lie also do not meet this standard. What would meet the standard would be correspondence expressing same-sex attraction, testimony from romantic or sexual partners, corroboration from multiple independent witnesses, or Göring's own statements about his sexuality. None of these forms of evidence exist in his case. The historiographical trend towards social and cultural history, moving beyond traditional focus on political and military events to examine how ordinary people lived and experienced history, has enriched our understanding of the past immensely. This trend has included recovering the history of marginalized groups, including LGBTQ people, whose experiences were often excluded from traditional historical narratives. However, this valuable historical project requires the same rigorous methodology as any other history. We do not serve the cause of recovering LGBTQ history by making unsupported claims about historical figures' sexuality. We serve it by carefully documenting cases where evidence exists by examining how LGBTQ people lived in different historical contexts and by being honest about what we can and cannot know. Applying different or lower standards of evidence to LGBTQ history than to other forms of history ultimately undermines, rather than supports, the project of recovering these important stories. The evolution of sexual norms and categories over time provides important context for understanding all historical sexuality questions. What we today categorize as homosexuality, bisexuality, heterosexuality, and other orientations did not map perfectly onto how people in earlier eras understood their own desires and identities. Some cultures and time periods had different categories entirely, or no categories of sexual orientation as opposed to sexual acts. The medicalization of homosexuality in the late 19th and early 20th centuries created the modern understanding of it as an identity rather than simply a behavior. By Göring's era, this modern framework existed, but it coexisted with older ways of thinking about sexuality. This complexity means we must be careful about retroactively applying our categories to historical figures. However, it does not mean we cannot use evidence to determine whether historical figures experienced same-sex attraction or engaged in same-sex relationships. We simply must interpret that evidence within appropriate historical context rather than anachronistically imposing modern frameworks. The final years of Göring's life, from his arrest in May 1945 through his trial and suicide in October 1946, were among the most thoroughly documented periods of any historical figure. He was under constant observation, his conversations were monitored, he was examined by multiple doctors and psychiatrists, he was interrogated extensively, and he spent 8 months in a public trial where every aspect of his life was scrutinized. If there had been any credible evidence of homosexuality, this would have been the time for it to emerge. The prosecutors had every incentive to present anything that would damage his credibility or expose hypocrisy. The psychologists studying him were looking for anything that would help explain his personality and actions. The other defendants, some of whom despised him and some of whom he had wronged, could have revealed secrets if they existed. The guards and prison staff who observed him daily left accounts of his behavior. Yet from all of this intensive scrutiny, no evidence of homosexuality emerged. This is significant not as proof of absence, but as a very thorough test that failed to produce the evidence one would expect if the rumors had any basis. The question of moral judgment and how it relates to factual claims about historical figures also warrants discussion. Some might suspect that defending Göring against false accusations about his sexuality somehow diminishes the moral judgment we should apply to his actual crimes. This is a misunderstanding of what historical accuracy requires. Saying that evidence does not support claims about Göring's homosexuality is not the same as defending Göring or minimizing his crimes. It is simply insisting on accurate information regardless of the moral character of the person being discussed. Göring was guilty of monstrous crimes, and those crimes are well documented and deserving of the strongest moral condemnation. His guilt does not, however, mean we should accept any accusation made against him regardless of evidence. Truth and justice both require distinguishing between what someone actually did and what they are merely accused of doing. This principle applies even to people who are guilty of terrible documented crimes. The nature of historical truth and how we establish it deserves reflection in the context of this question. Historical truth is probabilistic rather than absolute. We assess the likelihood that something happened based on available evidence, recognizing that we can rarely be completely certain about the past. Historians use terms like likely, possible, probable, well-documented, and speculative to indicate different levels of confidence in their claims. When it comes to Göring's sexuality, the appropriate assessment based on available evidence is his documented life shows 2 heterosexual marriages and biological fatherhood. There is no credible evidence of homosexual relationships, despite extensive documentation and research. Rumors about his homosexuality can be traced to wartime propaganda, political rivalry, and misinterpretation of personality traits, but these rumors lack evidentiary support. While we cannot know with absolute certainty about his private thoughts and any completely hidden behavior, the probability based on evidence is that he was heterosexual. This nuanced statement properly represents both what we can know and the limits of our knowledge. The responsibility of historians and educators to combat misinformation while acknowledging uncertainty is particularly challenging in cases like this. Simply stating, there is no evidence Göring was gay might not be sufficient because it does not explain why the rumor persists or how to evaluate the various sources making the claim. A more thorough response must explain the origins of rumors, the evidentiary standards that should apply, the specific evidence that does exist about his sexuality, and why that evidence points toward heterosexuality. It must also acknowledge that some questions about private behavior cannot be answered with complete certainty, while still making clear that unsupported speculation should not be treated as credible historical possibility. This is the kind of nuanced, evidence-based, methodologically sophisticated response that responsible history requires. The legacy of Hermann Göring in historical memory is complex and multifaceted. He is remembered primarily as a Nazi war criminal, the highest-ranking member of Hitler's regime to face trial, and someone whose fall from war hero to drug-addicted, bloated failure represents a kind of moral trajectory from bad to worse. His role in establishing concentration camps, his participation in the Holocaust, his massive corruption, and his failed leadership of the Luftwaffe define his historical significance. These are the aspects of his legacy that matter historically and morally. Questions about his personal life, including his sexuality, are of interest primarily to the extent they help us understand his psychology and actions. Since no credible evidence supports claims about homosexuality, such claims do not contribute to understanding him and instead represent a distraction from the documented historical record of his crimes and failures. The question of why this particular rumor about this particular historical figure continues to attract attention reveals something about contemporary culture's relationship with history, with sexuality, and with figures who represent ultimate evil. We are drawn to scandalous revelations about powerful and evil historical figures, perhaps because such revelations make them seem more comprehensible, or because they satisfy a desire for additional layers of condemnation. We are curious about the private lives of public figures, wondering what secrets might be hidden behind their public personas. We are sometimes uncomfortable with ambiguity and complexity, preferring simple explanations to the messy reality that people can contain contradictions without those contradictions revealing hidden sexual identity. All of these psychological and cultural tendencies contribute to the persistence of rumors about Göring's sexuality despite lack of evidence. Understanding these tendencies does not require accepting the rumors as true, but rather recognizing why we find them compelling even when they are unfounded. The intersection of this question with contemporary discussions about toxic masculinity, authoritarianism, and the psychology of fascism adds yet another dimension. Some modern analysts examine how fascist movements construct particular forms of masculinity and how those masculine ideals relate to the actual behavior and psychology of fascist leaders. Göring's vanity and theatricality can be analyzed as a form of hyper-masculine display, even though it violated Nazi ideals in some ways. He was collecting symbols of power and prestige, asserting dominance through material accumulation, and performing a kind of aristocratic masculinity that existed in tension with Nazi promotion of Spartan, martial masculinity. This analysis is valuable and does not require theories about hidden homosexuality to be meaningful. We can understand the performance of masculine power and its contradictions without conflating them with sexual orientation. The tendency to do so perhaps reflects lingering assumptions that any deviation from masculine norms must indicate homosexuality, an assumption that contemporary gender studies has worked to deconstruct. The future of historical research on this question is likely to follow the pattern of many historical debates, where initial sensational claims give way to more sober assessment as evidence accumulates and methodology improves. As archives continue to be digitized and made accessible, as new analytical tools allow researchers to examine large bodies of evidence efficiently, and as historical methodology becomes increasingly sophisticated, we are more rather than less likely to reach consensus on questions like Göring's sexuality. That consensus, based on current evidence, is that he was heterosexual. New evidence could theoretically emerge that would change this assessment, but the probability of such evidence existing decreases with each passing year as more archives are opened and more research is conducted without yielding supporting documentation. At some point, the absence of some evidence despite intensive search becomes itself a meaningful finding rather than simply a gap in knowledge. The educational value of examining this question thoroughly, as we have done in this exploration, extends beyond the specific case to demonstrate principles of historical reasoning that apply broadly. We have examined how to evaluate source credibility and motivation, how to distinguish between evidence and rumor, how to contextualize behavior within historical and cultural frameworks, how to avoid anachronistic projection of modern categories onto the past, how to proportion conclusions to evidence, how to acknowledge uncertainty while still reaching evidence-based judgments, how to consider multiple types of evidence and their relative weight, and how to resist cognitive biases that affect our evaluation of information about people we already judge as good or evil. These are skills and principles that apply to evaluating any historical claim or contemporary information. In an era of widespread misinformation, developing these analytical skills is crucial not just for understanding history, but for navigating contemporary information environments. The human tendency to seek simple explanations for complex phenomena affects how we approach questions about historical figures who committed atrocities. We want to understand what made them different, what marked them as monsters, what signs we could have detected that would have warned us of their capacity for evil. This search for explanatory keys can lead us to seize on any supposed abnormality, sexual, psychological, physical, as a potential answer. However, the uncomfortable truth that scholarship on perpetrators has revealed is that people who commit even the worst crimes are often not abnormal in obvious ways. They are products of ideology, social systems, historical circumstances, and individual choices rather than predetermined monsters marked by detectable deviance. Understanding perpetrators requires examining these complex factors rather than searching for simple signs of abnormality. In Göring's case, his narcissism, his greed, his ambition, his adoption of Nazi ideology, and his moral emptiness provide adequate explanation for his actions without needing to invoke speculation about hidden sexuality. So, having examined the question from multiple angles, assessed the evidence carefully, considered the context thoroughly, and applied rigorous historical methodology, what can we conclude? The answer to, was Hermann Göring gay based on available evidence, is no. Göring's documented life shows two heterosexual marriages characterized by romantic and sexual relationships, biological fatherhood, and no credible evidence of same-sex attraction or relationships. Rumors about his homosexuality originated in wartime propaganda, political rivalry among Nazi leaders, and misinterpretation of personality traits, particularly his vanity and theatrical self-presentation, that deviated from Nazi masculine ideals without indicating homosexuality. Despite decades of intensive historical research examining thousands of documents and testimonies, no credible evidence supporting claims of homosexuality has emerged. While we cannot know with absolute certainty about private thoughts and any completely hidden behavior, the preponderance of evidence indicates heterosexuality. Responsible history requires stating this conclusion clearly while acknowledging the limits of what we can know and explaining why rumors persist, despite lack of evidentiary support. This conclusion does not diminish the moral judgment we must apply to Göring's actual documented crimes. He was guilty of establishing concentration camps, participating in the Holocaust, directing strategic bombing of civilians, massive corruption, and countless other atrocities. He was convicted by an international tribunal and sentenced to death for crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. His legacy is one of monstrosity, and no amount of examination of his personal life changes that fundamental judgment. The question of his sexuality is ultimately a footnote to the historical record of his crimes, interesting primarily as a case study in how rumours originate and persist, how evidence should be evaluated, and how we should approach questions about historical figures' private lives when documentation is extensive, but rumours are unsupported. The broader lessons from this examination extend beyond Hermann Göring to how we approach all historical questions. We must distinguish between credible evidence and rumour. We must consider source reliability and motivation. We must contextualise behaviour within its historical and cultural setting, rather than imposing modern assumptions. We must acknowledge uncertainty while still reaching evidence-based conclusions. We must resist the temptation to accept sensational claims simply because they are interesting or because they concern people we already judge negatively. We must maintain consistent evidentiary standards regardless of the moral character of the person being studied. These principles of rigorous historical thinking are essential not just for understanding the past, but for navigating information in the present. The case of Hermann Göring also reminds us of the importance of separating different types of questions. Questions about what someone did, what crimes they committed, what role they played in historical events. These can often be answered with considerable confidence based on documentary evidence. Questions about what someone thought privately, what they felt emotionally, what their sexual desires were. These are often harder to answer with certainty and require more careful handling of evidence and acknowledgement of uncertainty. Conflating these different types of questions or applying the same level of confidence to all claims regardless of evidentiary support leads to poor history. We can be certain that Göring was guilty of war crimes. We can be reasonably confident based on extensive documentation that he was heterosexual. We cannot be certain about every private thought or feeling he ever had. These different levels of certainty should be reflected in how we make historical claims. Finally, this exploration demonstrates that even questions that seem simple or straightforward often require complex, nuanced answers when examined carefully. Was Göring gay? Seems like it should be a yes or no question with a simple answer, but providing a responsible answer requires examining evidence, understanding context, explaining methodology, acknowledging uncertainty, and addressing why the question persists despite lack of supporting evidence. This complexity is not a failure of historical method, but rather its strength. Careful analysis that honours complexity produces more accurate understanding than simple answers based on rumour or assumption. The goal of historical inquiry is not just to answer questions, but to answer them accurately, with appropriate nuance and with full awareness of how we know what we claim to know. Hermann Göring died by his own hand on October 15, 1946, hours before he was scheduled to hang for his crimes. His body was cremated and his ashes scattered to prevent any grave from becoming a shrine. His memory lives on primarily as a war criminal, one of the architects of Nazi Germany's atrocities, and one of the few senior Nazi leaders to face justice at trial. The question of his sexuality, examined thoroughly in this exploration, turns out to be an example of how rumours can persist despite lack of evidence, how propaganda and political rivalry create false narratives, and how personality traits can be misinterpreted through modern lenses. The historical record, examined rigorously, provides clear answers when we are willing to do the work of careful analysis, an honest acknowledgement of what evidence does and does not support. Well, that's it. Thanks for watching. We hope you found this video informative and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed learning about this topic and understanding how historians evaluate evidence and separate fact from rumour, make sure to check out our other videos about World War II history and Nazi Germany. We strive to provide accurate, evidence-based historical content that goes beyond sensationalism to examine what actually happened and how we know what we know. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on more historical explorations. Your support helps us continue creating in-depth, well-researched content about important historical topics. See you in the next one.